Welcome to the Landmark Difference Makers interview series, where we feature inspiring stories of people creating extraordinary impact around the world. Let's dive in. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be interviewing Dr. Wendy Sternberg, the visionary founder and executive/artistic director of Genesis of the Crossroads. Dr. Sternberg has been building peaceful communities at the intersection of social justice, education, and the arts to foster healing since 1999. Under her leadership, Genesis has launched over 150 transformative programs, earning international acclaim. She's a true doctor without a border, shaping a more compassionate and connected future, and we're very glad to have her here with us. Wendy, welcome.
Thank you, Seamus.
Wendy, let's start with, what is Genesis at the Crossroads?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. So it is a not-for-profit organization based in Chicago doing global work, looking at what are the things that bind us as human beings and help connect us towards a world that is serving everyone. So social justice is an underpinning. Otherwise said, it is an organization that is building peaceful communities at an intersection of social justice, education, art, and social impact business development. And we work in a number of areas that are all integrated. So one of them is arts and peace building, more in music than any other art form, but also in other ones. In leadership and peace building education for many different ages, not just young people, but professionals as well. And then looking at ways that arts-based humanitarian work and social impact business can be a force for good towards peace building and healing.
But you alluded to two projects that I want to ask you about. The first one pertains to arts and entertainment, or arts and music, and that's Saffron Caravan. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. In the beginning of Genesis, how I really cut my teeth, and for those of you that are dialing in from other parts of the world, cutting your teeth is when you come into knowing how to do different things. And I really cut my teeth working on cross-cultural collaborative festivals in music with a little bit of dance and a little bit of musical theater. And that became a prototype for us working on a number of issues related to the Middle East and North Africa, which was an area of focus, not the sole focus, but an area of focus. And we started that as a half-day program, grew that into a two-day festival that was an outdoor festival. Towards the latter part of that, we worked with the Mayor's Office of Special Events in Chicago, and the festival at its height had about 130 artists from around the world, from the Middle East and North Africa, and also from the United States. And one of our senators in downstate Illinois wanted to bring the whole festival to downstate, to Carbondale, and traveling 130 artists was untenable at best, and the cost of it was enormous. And the logistics were just so difficult to do that it became the kind of thing that was hard to travel around the world. And so we started looking at, could we do something that serves the footprint of what we're getting at, which is this cross-cultural collaborative space? And could we bring artists together from areas of conflict to show that music and dance can be a bridge to bring people together, and to show ways that we can explore our common humanity? So in 2007, Saffron Caravan was the finale of our festival in Chicago. And prior to that, we had been touring groups we had put together, asking people to suspend disbelief about working with the other side, to come together to create new music and perform it. And we toured that around the country. And in 2007, we created our own ensemble called Saffron Caravan. So the artists in that are from Iran, Afghanistan, Cuba, Morocco, Israel, India, Brazil, Venezuela, and the United States.
What would a typical performance look like if you were to attend, or we were to attend?
Wow. I think you'd find that we very carefully pick the context in which we have the performances. So they're often at cultural centers. They are in places where there have been sometimes very difficult situations, like Srebrenica in Bosnia, where there was a genocide, and we're showing that people can now come together, and the arts are a great vehicle to demonstrate that. We've performed in Jerusalem for a very mixed audience of Arab and Jews together, which might seem almost impossible today. And we just recently performed at the Capitol for Congress to invite them into a conversation for what it is to do bridge building. So that's a little bit about the context. I think you'd find the music really interesting. Like, we usually hear music with a Western scale. So that's that's half tones. And the maqam in Arab music is quarter tones. So it's a very different sound. And you might be exposed to instruments you've never heard of before. So one of the pictures you'll see a little bit later is the rabab or rababa that one of our students learned. And that instrument, no one really knows where that came from. Turkey claims it is theirs. Morocco claims it is theirs, and a number of other countries in the Middle East claim it as their own. And I find that interesting because I think it really belongs to all of us and speaks to that. So in this picture, you see Haitham holding the oud, and a lot of people confuse that with a guitar. It's the actual origin of a guitar. You'll hear music in at least 7, if not 9 different languages. And it's not fusion music. It's looking at something fundamental and foundational to Genesis at the Crossroads, which is, if we are able to share who we are as individuals and share our culture, not only does conflict have an opportunity to lessen, but if people in that space can truly be known, conflict can disappear.
Well, there's something that, everybody loves music of one kind or another. In your experience, what is it about the medium of music that has that power?
So there's a few things, and I love music also. This is the rabab, by the way, for all of you who are wondering what that instrument was. So music, first of all, there's a lot of music that has no lyrics, and I think we often get tripped up on language. Though I believe language matters and is incredibly important. It's important in all of the education at Landmark, and it's important to me as a former language major as an undergrad. But I think at times when we listen to music, we are in a space of opening ourselves up to sound, to another culture, to another person. And it's very easy to move a person through music. And our intellect can often be turned off, and the side of ourselves that can be opened up quite a lot more is our heart and our soul, a more contemplative side of ourselves. And the moment that that music touches us, moves us, takes us to a transcendent place, we can no longer look at that person or that culture exactly the same. And therein lies a moment for transformation.
And the other thing that provokes for me is, you're a doctor. Not only that, you went to the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, and you did a residency at the University of Chicago. Those are very elite institutions. And yet this is now what you do full time. What led you to make a transition from a career that you obviously prepared so much for to something entirely different?
So I had a colleague of mine who had taken the Landmark Forum and introduced me to it, not by telling me about it, but by actually having some things show up in her life. And I was very curious, how does a person at a particular age start embracing whole new things? I wasn't really looking to transform my life. I was pretty happy where I was, but I knew one thing, which was that my whole creative self needed an awful lot of energy focused on it that had nothing to do with my career. And I came to an introduction, And inside of a couple hours was very clear this work gets at the essence of how we're wired, how we're put together, how we make decisions, basically the scaffold of our life was on display. And I ended up deciding to take the Landmark Forum. And in the course, I distinctly remember a moment where somebody said something akin to, if you could have a white canvas and create your whole life anew, would it be exactly the way it was? Or would you create it completely differently? And the fundamental question was, does your life work for you? And no one ever asked me that question directly. You know, I could tell you it was a lot of work having a film class and a dance class and a group I sang with and going to the theater and doing all these other things. But nobody ever asked me, does it all work? And the fundamental answer was, it was a ton of energy to put it all together. And all of that creative juice was not in my work. You don't really want to go to a doctor who says, today's my creative day. When you come in with a headache or hypertension or whatever. And so that was an opening for me to say, well, if I were to create it anew, putting creativity in my life, what would it look like as part of my day-to-day job? And that was a big opening for me.
And what would you say it is about the mission of Genesis that really speaks to you personally?
Well, I created Genesis in a self-expression and leadership program, also through Landmark. And although the design of the course is not necessarily to create a not-for-profit that you end up leaving your career and running full-time, I think at that particular time, which is now 24 years ago, if somebody had said that to me, my question would have been, what are you smoking? Like, I'm a doctor, I'm staying put. And I think when I looked at living a creative life, I had a seminal event in Landmark that I think is worth sharing as an anecdote, because it's really what opened space for me to think about this conversation. I didn't go from being a doctor to saying, I want to run an arts education, social justice, not-for-profit. What happened to me is we were in a classroom, and one of the leaders in the classroom was talking about this conversation around filters. So the analogy was, if you put on a pair of yellow sunglasses, when you first put them on, the world looks yellow, and that's so unusual. But as human beings, we habituate to things. And so the world starts to look yellow. That's just how it is. In other words, it's like a truth. The world is yellow. And the leader stopped and he said, turn to the person sitting next to you and just share what you notice. Map this onto your life. Think a little bit about how this plays into your life. So I turned to the person by the directive to my left, and that person happened to be an Arab American who's from a Palestinian family. I'm Jewish American. And what ensued was a conversation where we shared a bit about ourselves. He also went to elite institutions. He had parents that were professional, that cared about education, that were involved in community. They resembled my parents in a number of ways, though the professions were different. And I remember at a point thinking, well, how is it that I've had all this this animosity towards this culture when I thought I could travel anywhere, go anywhere, be with anyone, anywhere around the world? That was part of my identity. And then here was this person from a culture where, well, I could do that with everybody else, but not that community. And then at one point he leaned in. This is a 2 to 3 minute paired share. He leans in and he says, you know, you're the first Jewish woman I've ever listened to, meaning without the filter. And it was one of those comments where not only did my hair fly backwards, but the floor fell out from under me. Like, how is it I had this identity that I could cross borders, I could go anywhere, I could be with anybody, oh, but except for this community. And I found myself thinking about, how did we ever get here? Like, I even liked this person I just met 2 to 3 minutes before. And so I started thinking, how do we get at this, to undo this, to get at what was foundational to this. My parents weren't hate-filled people. His family wasn't either. So what do we do to undo this? But not just undo it, create a paradigm where people can actually come together and learn about one another, from one another, and create opportunity to work together and to work together on things that matter in the world. And so I literally walked into a dance class of mine. I've only had this happen once before. I walked into the dance class and I had the entire vision for Genesis at the Crossroads all in one flash, which was that the arts are neutral and creative and can connect us, that we can deepen that work through education and we can put it into the world through a social justice frame. And when we do that, peace and healing are both possible.
Another thing that I know you're extremely passionate about is the Genesis Academy, and really a concern for creating leadership, future leadership in peace. Can you tell us more about that?
Oh, I can. It's one of my absolute favorite parts of the organization. And many of you are seeing some of the photographs that are from the students that come from all over the world. So I think I often say to people that the longer I do Genesis at the Crossroads, and mind you, next year is our 25th anniversary, but the longer I do this work, I say we need to go higher and lower. And people get very confused by what I mean by that. When I say higher, I mean to the policy level. And when I say lower, to younger and younger people. And that's not just because I'm getting older. It's because if we are going to work on shaping the world, we have to look at young people and the issues that they face today, very different than how we were growing up. And, when I think about when I started Genesis, we talked about youth coming from areas of conflict and post-conflict zones. And now it looks like the whole world's one big conflict zone. So if we want to get at shaping the world, we have to involve young people. And we have to look at not just the numbers, like, are we impacting thousands and thousands of people, or are we impacting future leaders that in their time can impact thousands of people who will impact thousands of people? So I'm very interested in taking exceptional youth from areas that are particularly difficult in the world, who might not say, I'm a next generation youth leader, but know that their life is in service of something bigger than themselves. And I would say their next generation, Nelson Mandela's, next generation, Martin Luther King's, next generation Golda Meir's. And I think we need to be paying attention to the ways that they live, their ideas. Some of them in different parts of the world are already shaping the world that have nothing to do with Genesis. But I think it's a very important part of our work is to capacity build their leadership and focus on giving them agency and voice, that they matter in the matter of the things that are difficult issues in the world.
What do you think is what do most people don't know they don't know about young people today?
Well, they don't know that they ache to have their voice heard and make a difference. They're often seen, with earbuds and tuned out and self-absorbed. And actually, most of them, if you unplug that, that's a mechanism to just go away, to go inside themselves and tune out how noisy and crazy the world is. But if you ask them, do you want to make a difference? Most of them want to. And I think, there are cynical young people. I'm not saying all young people are open and ready to get at things, but I think they've had less of life to disappoint them and less of leadership to disappoint them. And they see opportunities where they can emulate a young person who's doing work in the world. We have the youngest Nobel Prize winner in the last few years. That would have been unheard of in my generation. So now we have somebody who people can emulate, a woman from a repressive environment like Pakistan, who goes out to say every kid can have a pencil and learn, or a pen and can learn. and that's Malala Yousafzai.
One of the things that has to be something that you've confronted, when it comes to a topic of peace, when it comes to, you alluded to the world feels like it's all one conflict zone, and certainly if you look at it, through a particular lens, there's a lot of evidence for that. That's obviously not where you stand. But what do you think is the biggest, how would you describe the cynicism that's there that you have to contend with?
Well, I'm a New York Times reader. I also did a fellowship where we looked at newspapers from 3 different parts of the world to even approximate getting some aspect of a truth about any issue in the world. And I find it's even hard for me to read the newspaper some days. It's just bad news, depressing news, more depressing, morbidly depressing. It's we're saturated with so many images of destruction and death and violence. Like if I see another woman holding a dead child in a hijab, like it's hard to take in all of that. And so our natural tendency is to turn off the television, put the newspaper away, just go on a period of a break from all input that's just dragging us down, for lack of a more sophisticated term. And I think, well, there's a lot of things about that. One is, I think we need to be telling different stories about what's going on in the world. There's an awful lot of the world that's working on making the world a better place. We don't hear about that. It doesn't sell papers. It's not sexy. And one of the campaigns I am on a mission to get across to people is that peace building can be sexy. It can sell, it can make money, it can do things. And for as far as we know, it's an awful lot less expensive than warmongering.
You talked earlier about the young people when asked, do you want to make a difference? And, I have a 15-year-old daughter, and she seems pretty conscious and aware of the algorithms, in news and social media that are amplifying much of what you were just describing. Is there anything, you see working with young people that has them better equipped to deal with that cynicism than perhaps the rest of us?
Well, I think when they're exposed to something new, they get perhaps a bit more excited than we do. I think when you can tap into excitement and passion, or take a young person and displace them into something where they've never been before, and have something open up for them, there's an access point there. And I think many of us are old enough to say, well, I don't really want to challenge myself that much, or I don't want to be inconvenienced, or going a little outside my comfort zone threatens me. Whereas a young person, when you take them there, there's an excitement there. And it might be confronting, but through that excitement, you can get at what is it that's confronting you? What are you learning? What are you taking in? And work with all of that. And I think in a lot of ways, younger people are easier to navigate that.
If those of us of a certain age, or live some life, we have a past that we deal with, and certainly it colors our view of whether something's possible, whether something's viable, whether something's worth your time. And certainly world peace and this possibility of peace that Genesis is committed to is something that I think there's a lot of doubt. You keep putting energy into this, you keep creating this, knowing, because you're a smart person, knowing you may not see the result that you're standing for. What allows for that?
What allows for that for me?
Yeah.
Well, I think I have taken on this line that I use now. I'm setting the table for the next generation. And I actually think it's for multiple generations. I have no sense whatsoever that I will see world, or no assurance in any regard that I will see world peace in my lifetime, my son's lifetime, anybody else's lifetime that's living right now. I think it's a future tense. I think if we don't learn how to undo this us versus them concept or zero-sum dynamics, we're all going down, whether it's from climate change or another pandemic, which may be linked to climate change, or some other conflict that erupts around the world. And so I think we need to connect to our collective humanity. But that kind of work is slow. It's about encounter, which Genesis is fundamentally about. Like I was saying, when you meet the other and you learn to be stirred or moved by their culture and their identity and their ideas, that encounter, that one-on-one connection is enduring, but it takes a long time.
It's funny. I have had a couple conversations recently, personally, with people that are younger than me about this idea that the world is just a mess. It's never been so bad. And I always think about, when I was in my 20s, I had a chance to meet a Holocaust survivor. Not at an event. He was running a used clothing store, and I went in and I bought something, and I saw his tattoo from the concentration camp on his forearm. And I asked him about it, and he spent 40 minutes telling me the story of his experience and his family. And after I had that conversation with him, he made me promise to never forget and to tell the story. And I took that up on myself. But, now when I look at that and I think about, what that time was like during the Second World War, or the First World War, or the time of the plague, or any place in the world that's had the plague. I mean, things have been really, really bad in the past. And, yet there are things that are happening today that, there's no point in comparing them. They're unacceptable now. What would you say to somebody, given you're, in the midst of this and you keep bringing yourself forward? What would you say to somebody that doesn't think it would matter? What would you tell them?
Well, I often use an analogy to medicine that I think is something I know well. Like, we have all the technology in the world to keep people alive for a long, long, long time, even when they have no quality of life, right? So we have a responsibility as a doctor to do no harm. We take an oath when we graduate from medical school, from Hippocrates, as everybody knows, right? So now we have technology, we have nuclear warfare, now we have AI, artificial intelligence, but we have to be mindful how we use these things. We have the ability to gather tremendous amount of data, but are we mindful of how much of that data is accurate? Are we careful about, when we look at statistics and impact, what are we measuring? A lot of things look at numbers, but numbers don't tell the whole story. Sometimes we need the narrative metric, and we need to hear the stories from people of what's their direct lived experience as an impact. And so I think we have to ask a different set of questions. There's been a lot of ways that we've been doing things in education that's serving an industrial model from the 40s and 50s in this world, particularly in the developed world. But I don't think the developed world is so much more developed than the less developed world. I think we're all developing, and we would be wise to learn solutions from countries that maybe have a lot less than we do in the United States, and think about how we share ideas and solution making for the greater good of humanity. So I think we need to expand the denominator of how we're thinking about things. Who's the us that's being impacted? Who's sitting at the table to make the decisions about those things? And who said that they could sit at the table?
Yeah, I think about how, there's ample evidence for that it's working, and there's ample evidence for that it's not working, and we all have a choice. Because there's no somebody can disprove that any of this is making a difference.
Mm-hmm.
That you continue anyway. And I that's really my takeaway from what you just said, is that one need not necessarily be concerned with the scoreboard, just play. Well, before we wrap up, I want to ask one question that it's a favorite of mine to ask. One of the things that keeps you going, obviously, is you're touched, you're moved by this. But could you share with us one of the things that has been the most moving or inspiring for you in your experience of managing Genesis all these years?
I think there was one moment back in a number of years ago in 2011. We went to the Middle East, and we had an Iranian santur virtuoso with us. And we were performing for the Bedouin community in the desert. And these students had they had very little arts and culture. Much of the community was living with raw sewage, no electricity. It was a very impoverished community, very much at the margins. And this young Bedouin girl looked at the Iranian musician. She said, how did you even get into this country? How did you get here? How is it that we could meet you? And there was just this moment of disbelief that the world could come close enough to her that she could embrace, and I don't mean physically embrace, but embrace another human's culture that had been completely off limits to her. So that was one thing. And then from that same program, we worked with the head of a math science school whose name was Jihad. And that is often a name that's associated with something incredibly negative, but it's actually the idea of testing yourself to get to the highest level of your own self is what true jihad is. But he was the head of this math science school, and we had a Jewish musician in our ensemble who's actually of Greek descent, and he said, if you told me I could fall in love with a man named Jihad, and I don't mean a romantic fall in love, I mean just fall in love with somebody's culture, he said, I wouldn't have believed this. And yet here I am seeing this person who's dedicated his life to educating young kids from the margins and having us come as an ensemble to perform in the middle of the desert. We are the first public performance this community has had in thousands of years. And that was incredibly impactful. And then one of the other ones that I often share when I keynote is I was in a fellowship through Rotary International in peace and conflict studies. And we did 2 field studies, one to the Mekong subregion and one to Cambodia. And in the Mekong subregion, we looked at conflict over land and water, and we looked at cycles that were keeping a number of conflict issues in place, namely regarding sex trafficking and human trafficking and drug trafficking. And then in Cambodia, we looked at a number of human rights issues, and it happened to be timed out in 2009 when the Khmer Rouge was on trial for crimes against humanity. And that just happened to be the year that I did the fellowship. And I don't think there are any coincidences. And we were split up into small groups. The whole fellowship was 22 people. So 5 of us were in each group, or about that amount. And we drove into the jungle in Cambodia, and we met with former Khmer Rouge combatants. And my group was with 2 other people, one from Kenya and one from Sri Lanka. So we couldn't have been more different from one another. And we were interviewing 5 men who were the last stronghold of the Khmer Rouge. When they laid down their weapons, the war was over in Cambodia. And We had a set of questions, we had translators, because it was a very nuanced conversation. You know, you couldn't do it in broken English. And I had a notion, there was groupthink, these were agrarian farmers, they were poor, they were uneducated, they didn't know better, they were convinced of something. Had they had a more sophisticated background or a life where they could think for themselves, then they would have made other decisions. And I came to find out my context is from Nuremberg and the Holocaust as a Jewish person. Theirs is Buddhism. So one has nothing to do with one another. Theirs is something happened in a past life. It gets reconciled it gets lived out in this life. It gets reconciled in another life. But I had it that we were teaching them. It was very much from us to them. And then when we were done asking them questions, the leader of the group took out a pad and a pen and started asking us questions. Why are you here? What made you want to come? What are you getting out of this? What are you taking home with you? And then he started taking notes as each of us were talking. And I realized, like, I had no idea what their world was like. And it was a lot about assumptions, kind of like how it was when I was talking to the other person in that filters conversation. And one of the questions we had asked him is, what are you teaching your grandchildren who, you know, climbed up the coconut tree and tapped a coconut for us because it was about 115 degrees in the jungle where we were with air trapping. And he's teaching his children, his grandchildren, right from wrong. He's teaching his children things he wasn't necessarily taught, but lived through, about where he's not okay with certain actions and ideas. And that entire experience rearranged my molecules.
Wendy, where do you see Genesis in the future? 5 years, 10 years, when you're no longer involved?
Oh, I'll be involved in 5 to 10 years. I might be pulled back a little bit more, mentoring and writing a bit more about my experience. I want to be working on a book about what it is to follow your passion and stick with it when things are tough, whether it's the economy or the political climate or whatever the circumstances. And I want to be mentoring young people to shoulder this work and move forward. And have the time to really get to know them individually and capacity build their individual voices. But I think the piece that will be the legacy piece of Genesis that's already in motion is the Genesis Peace Hub. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about what's the structure, what's the tent, what's the physical context under which or with which all of this gets done. And, you know, the pandemic allowed us to do an awful lot by Zoom. We couldn't be having this conversation without a platform, whether it's Zoom or any other platform, Microsoft Teams, et cetera. And I think we can do an awful lot reaching the world through these kinds of online platforms. So when we did Sounds of Healing, which was a collaborative effort between Saffron Caravan and the Genesis Academy Summer Institute graduates, we actually had people register in Iran for the program. That's how far we reached in the world. And you saw a map. We did a program with the State Department, and the pins were all the places of the people who called in. But there is nothing that replaces the face-to-face encounter and all that we learn from body language and being with people, and actually not in a classroom, taking a walk, going to the pool, or breaking bread and just casually exploring ideas and conversation. And so the Genesis Peace Hub was going to be in one place with a boarding school for global leadership when it first got created as a construct. This is back in being tooled around 2010, 11, 12, 13. And the Summer Institute was the prototype building a boarding school for global leadership and peace building. And then the pandemic came in and interrupted or disrupted all of that. And around the same time, or a little bit before that, around the same time and a little bit after that, we helped evacuate one of our students from Afghanistan during that hideous period in history, and started looking at the need to not just have a peace hub in the United States, but looking at it as an ecosystem of components all around the world. So, and it's a longer story how we chose these places, but the Peace Hub will have 4 main sites and 2 satellite sites. In North America, it'll be in Chicago. In Africa, it will be in Mauritius and Ghana. In Europe, it will be in Berlin and Normandy, and eventually New Zealand. And not every component of the Peace Hub will be in every location, but together they create this ecosystem for building peaceful communities that foster healing. And that's the construct in the future through which all of Genesis's programs will be happening. And then we'll be adding a couple components. I mentioned before that I had studied a bit in my fellowship about conflict over land and water. And as climate change is happening and resources are shrinking, we're gonna see more conflict as people have this sense of, well, if they're getting something, then I better get more because there's less of something, a shrinking pie or a zero-sum dynamic. And I think we need to pay attention to climate change. So we'll be adding some innovation around farming and food justice and healthcare justice as we innovate in the agriculture space and think about farm to table, the role of food in bread breaking and peace building. And then sports and social change is one of the other components at the Peace Hub, but again, not at every location.
Well, Wendy, I thank you for the scope of your vision and your tireless energy in the cause. It's really, really inspiring.
Thank you.
Just thank you for your time being with us.
Thank you, Seamus.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Landmark Difference Makers. If you're inspired by what you heard and you want to learn more about Landmark's programs or explore upcoming episodes, visit landmarkforumnews.com. You'll find resources, event details, and more stories of people making an extraordinary impact around the globe. If you're already part of the Landmark community, check out the Landmark subscription designed to provide ongoing support in creating a life you love. Visit landmarkworldwide.com to learn more. Until next time, keep creating, keep contributing, and keep making a difference.